Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Welcome to this latest in the Innovation at Work webinar series from MIT Sloan Executive Education. Our aim in the last few weeks has been to provide a weekly webinar, which I know many of you are joining us for, because we really want to help everyone keep pace with as many different ideas from the Sloan School that could be helpful to you in your work and in your careers, even with everything that's going on right now. And of course, we're also very familiar with this phenomenon of having so many Zoom meetings and webinars and other things to do that we've shortened the format as well to this 30 minutes. And we hope that works for you. I think that's very relevant as well to the title of today's webinar, which is about overload and what we can do about it. We certainly don't want to add to your overload in the process of doing this. For this webinar, I'm delighted and honored to be joined by Professor Erin Kelly from MIT Sloan. She's the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies and a core member of our faculty in the Institute for Work and Employment Research. Her research has been published in many top sociology, management, and interdisciplinary journals, and she's twice been recognized with the Rosabeth Moss Cantor Award. She has also been working on a research investigation that we will, I'm sure, talk more about in the coming 20 or 30 minutes, which is fundamentally relevant to the question of how we design our organizations and our work policies to be more not only human-centric, but as a result more effective and more efficient and more profitable ultimately for our businesses. So I think there's a lot of great and relevant insights that Erin Kelly will have to share with us today. And with that, I'd like to move right away to asking some questions. As Lindy said, the Q&A panel is open. Please feel free to answer questions as our discussion moves along. I will do my best to keep reviewing those questions and incorporate them into this discussion. But to kick things off, I mentioned, Erin, the research project that you have been working on over the past several years, I suppose. And perhaps just as an introduction, you could tell us a little bit more about, what is that research project? What have you been doing? And how does it relate to this question of overload? Just really what motivated the research? What are you doing? And what are some of the key sort of headlines that you've discovered so far?
That's great. Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here. I wish I could see you all, but I appreciate that you're taking time out of your day or your evening to check in and be part of this discussion. So I'm going to be sharing some highlights from my new book that is co-authored with Phyllis Moen called Overload: How Good Jobs Went Bad and What We Can Do About It. Thank you. And this came out just in March, right as we were heading home from the workplace. It was written, of course, long before coronavirus changed our lives and changed our work experiences. But we believe that there are insights here that are helpful before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and will be helpful after this crisis period. So when we talk about overload, we're talking about the sense that there's just too much to do, that you're being asked to do too much at work and you feel rushed, you feel overwhelmed. In the firm that we studied that's kind of at the center of this book, we saw that overload resulted in part from repeated downsizing and from the need to coordinate in a global labor chain. So we were studying a Fortune 500 firm primarily, although we talk about how this phenomenon is experienced in lots of different professions and settings. And in that case, people were working during the regular day, but also stretching their work hours to coordinate with teams around the world. I'm sure that's familiar to many of you. And all of that was facilitated by technology that meant your coworkers, your clients, your peers, your managers believed that they could reach you at any time, and that implicitly you should be monitoring that and responding to that. So we went into this company and just had this overwhelming sense that people were exhausted, burned out, stretched too thin. And they talked very explicitly about how this was leading them to not be able to perform as well as they would like. You know, that you can't be creative and innovative when you're just flat out exhausted all of the time. So that's how we came to define this issue of overload. And then we were lucky enough to be part of a major research group, the Work, Family, and Health Network, so an interdisciplinary collaboration that put together a workplace change, an initiative that we could test. And so we tested it as a true field experiment. So in the IT division of this Fortune 500 company, we identified 56 departments or teams, work groups, and half of them were randomly assigned to go through what we call a work redesign initiative, and I can talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the other half continued on with the usual company policies. And so this allowed us to really rigorously test, can we change the work experience in a way that benefits employees and the firm without actually changing anything else about their job, just changing the norms, the expectations, the routines, helping people work smarter, but also work in a more sustainable way. I'll stop there, Peter, on this.
Yeah. There's already a lot of questions coming in, and so I'm trying to read those as well. But
okay, sure. I can talk about the results if you'd like. I'm happy to move on to that too.
I think that would be very helpful. And,
okay.
and perhaps some of the questions that are coming in also, not surprisingly, are wondering, given as you said that you did this research before the current situation with coronavirus, perhaps we can hold in our minds for later if there are any particular differences that you think that you're seeing, or what might have been different if you'd done the research now rather than when you did.
Sure, I'm happy to address that later. So to, I guess, share the punchline, so we found that this work redesign initiative had clear benefits for employees, actually for their family members as well, and for the firm. And when I talk about a work redesign initiative, I'm using the term work redesign because this was not like a simple policy that rolled out. It was not a one-time training that people went to and then went back to their regular ways of working. It was a team-based process where managers and employees together really talked through, how are we doing our work? Do we want to work at home or not? What makes sense for us in terms of schedules? How can we coordinate and collaborate effectively without feeling like we have to always be monitoring and responding to emails and texts and chat? Basically giving people space and permission to reimagine how they do their work together, with the fundamental assumption that employees should have as much choice or control over how they put their lives together, their work lives together with the rest of their lives, and the fundamental expectation that people are going to be focused on getting the job done and going to get concrete about what that looks like. And so after these teams went through this work redesign initiative, we could compare them both to themselves beforehand, because we had baseline data, and to their peers in our control group. And we found that employees in the work redesign group had less stress, less psychological distress, which is a non-clinical measure of mental health. They were less burned out. The firm benefited because these employees reported higher levels of job satisfaction. Few of them were planning to quit. And in fact, we followed people over 3 years after the rollout, and 40% fewer of the of the work redesign group voluntarily left the company in that period. So a really dramatic difference in exits. I should say that work-life conflicts also fell, but one of the key insights from our study is that these conversations can be framed as work-family or work-life issues, but that kind of sets up the expectation that it's moms or parents or caregivers who are unable to work in the current, under the current rules of the game. And in fact, we saw broad dissatisfaction. People of all ages and all life stages were miserable before this initiative and benefited from it. We also have stories of health changes, sleep changes, and more. And when you add all of that together, even if the firm had paid for every cent of the training experience, there would have been an ROI of 1.6, driven largely by the differences in turnover in the treatment group versus the control group.
That's great. I think this is one of the challenges and questions that people ask a lot is how do we think about the potential impacts on essentially productivity, which obviously is a notoriously difficult thing to measure, unless perhaps you're an economist, but that's a very narrow definition of the term. How did you approach that question in this study, and do you think that that's a well-founded concern?
Yeah, it is a great question. We would have loved to see evidence of higher productivity. In our quantitative analysis, we found null results, so meaning no difference, positive or negative, when we compare the group that went through the work redesign initiative to their peers in the control group. From the qualitative interviews, I should have mentioned that along with this experiment, we did 400 interviews over 5 years to really understand how the company changed and how people's experiences altered through this process. And from those interviews, we heard many, many stories of greater focus, higher engagement, feeling like you were able to step back and do smarter work and more creative work well. And so employees and frontline managers were very positive about how it was changing work quality, even though our quantitative measures of productivity didn't show any benefit or harm.
You mentioned there the question of frontline managers. Mm-hmm. What's the kind of support, training, perhaps, that was necessary for managers who perhaps their role changes a lot with these kinds of changes? What's the real essential kind of change in capabilities and attitudes that you need in managers for this kind of work redesigns to actually be able to be effective?
That's a great question. They would talk about it as a switch from hallway monitor or monitoring butts and seats to a coaching metaphor. So, to really helping people see what's in the way of me doing my best work and how can I move forward with that. One thing I'd like to mention is that the particular work redesign initiative we studied is freely available at workfamilyhealthnetwork.org under the office toolkits. And that's because our study was funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. And so one of the requirements of that federal funding is to make the training materials freely available. We also, in chapter 8 of the book, talk about other initiatives that we see as very similar, very aligned. And Peter, I know that your team, your department had been through an initiative that is somewhat similar, and we actually talk about in the book as well.
Great. And we're getting some questions about this. One of the things that we in our own department spent a lot of time thinking about was the challenge of creating what could be a 24/7 culture by introducing flexibility and giving and empowering people to work how and when that they want to. that maybe there's a risk of having the opposite effect because now we're always on and everything's always urgent. So did you find that kind of challenge, and what are some of the approaches that people should be thinking about to avoid that?
That was also a worry we had, that we were going in trying to create some positive change, but we could, further intensify people's experience and create more stress for them. I think one difference is that flexibility initiatives that just announce you can work whenever and wherever you want don't help teams create new norms of, how do we work smarter? And in the absence of explicit discussion about how are we going to work and what's the value of us being offline, people can slide into a sense that it's wise, it's safer to just be available all the time. But that's actually part of the recipe for overload and for burnout. And so the teams in our study would often talk about how are we going to tame the technology? How are we going to use it for our purposes? And how are we going to reach each other when we're not monitoring our phones and other devices? Recognizing that there's value to having heads down time away from the email, the chat, whatever. As well as heads down time for work and also time fully away for recovery and for rest and getting ready to tackle things in a creative way.
Great. Could you say a bit more about your thoughts on the process? You mentioned a bit about this of implementing. You sort of described an initiative as potentially being top down. And I think I take from your answer that you would advocate for something which is much more engaging with the workforce in terms of deciding together what we wish the culture to be and the norms to be around these questions. But presumably there's still a really vital role for leaders to both support and walk the talk.
Right. I mean, the initiative that we studied and the other initiatives I would advocate for do begin with the presumption that people closest to the work have a lot to share and know what needs to be done and can help kind of identify some low value tasks, trim some tasks that are taking up too much time. But you're right that there needs to be a clear message from leadership at the top and the middle. I would say the director level is key, that this kind of change is welcome, that the leadership team is confident that there will be benefits for the organization and for employees. And so that's when employees feel trusted, they feel supported, and those are critical elements of the kind of positive change that we had documented.
Yep, some of the questions also coming in, I think, are contemplating the difference between flexible work, where there's still a significant amount of in-person sort of interactivity and requirement, versus organizations that have really gone totally virtual, which of course we're now all having to do because of to sort of think about what are we seeing in the present circumstance that sort of sheds any light on what happens when we go from a somewhat structured but with flexibility to really everybody being remote and everybody dealing with all of the other challenges that we're all facing because our children aren't in school and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great transition to kind of what do we learn from this current moment. And I would say that one key point is that the benefits of flexibility and of the type of initiative I've described depend in part on employees feeling that they have some choice or some control. And we're at a moment when everything is uncertain, and all we know is that we've been sent home, right? And also, as you mentioned, the teams that we studied would craft their ideal balance of in-person and in-office and shift that across projects and over time. And so what we're seeing right now are some of the challenges of being completely virtual under conditions of limited choice or control, and of course, facing this extra stress of a public health crisis. And many of us have kids or other family members at home who need some of our attention, so really being confronted by that. So I think that you didn't quite ask this, but I'm going to offer it. I think that managers at this point can respond to the current moment in two ways. First, recognizing that this is not a fair test of flexible working, and it's not actually what I would call a full-blown work redesign at this moment, because it was rushed and it was urgent and it was not chosen in a process of team reflection. The second, of course, is recognizing that we all need explicit expressions of support at this moment. And part of that is being clear that your employees should be taking time away from work, getting offline, both to do their work and to take care of themselves as best they can. I think that how we treat each other now will be remembered for a long, long time. I'm kind of hopeful in a sense that this emergency has dislodged old expectations and opened up a space for, creatively constructing more sane and sustainable company cultures. But for that to happen, we have to go from just get it done and people feeling worried that they must prove that they're still working by being constantly available, to some kind of thoughtful reflection on how do we want to work together as a team. I think that there's a hope there, but if we don't kind of tackle that proactively, the default is that this turns into endless work, and we're setting ourselves up to deal with burnout in the next year or two.
That's interesting. And from what you're seeing, I guess this obviously couldn't have been directly in your research because it's a current phenomenon. But do you think that some of the values and culture will be changing permanently for us around questions like work-life, not balance, but integration? And so many parents, for example, have really needed the support of their teams and of their managers to be able to juggle all these things. That, is that something which feels like it's going to become a lasting effect, or are we going to just bounce back to the old ways as soon as we're allowed to?
Yeah, I hope that people will be more transparent about their family responsibilities, their caregiving responsibilities, their own need to take care of their health, right? We all have bodies, and the ways that we have been working in the past are not necessarily good for us over the medium to long term. There is a worry that because we're at a moment where people are losing jobs and where unemployment is rising, without explicit messages from management that we see you, we see the good work you're doing, we're not judging exactly how many hours you're working or exactly how responsive you are to my text or my chat or whatever. Without that message, many people will feel pressured to just do everything they can and be as visible as they can, out of a sense that if I don't give it my all, then I'm going to lose this job. Of course, the irony is that when we're all running scared, we can't actually do the good work. All we do is spend the time and the effort trying to prove that we're dedicated, but not necessarily setting the firm up to get to the next stage or make, have the real changes that might be helpful in the longer term.
Right. Some of the questions that have been coming in were asking something along the lines of, a lot of leaders and managers seem perhaps to be doing a lot more procrastinating in this situation, perhaps because of the challenges of the uncertainty and these extra stresses that you're talking about. do you have any sense of how teams and organizations and leaders, what's been effective for really recognizing that for everybody, it's not just the workforce, it's the leaders and the managers that are really facing these kinds of stresses as well? It's very easy for us to say, look, as managers, as leaders, these are the things that we have to do, but we're people too.
Right, right. I do think that it's time that what works well is getting very clear on what's critical to the mission for the next 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. Now, I know it's really hard because 6 months we just can't imagine necessarily. But it's important to think through, what do we do right now? What is essential that we do right now? And what do we let go of? We can't both reinvent our world and do everything as normal at the same time. And so to the extent that we're focused on really adapting to these changes, managers, leaders, and individual employees need to think about, what am I ready to give up for the moment, so that I can do the best job at the adaptation work, if that makes sense.
It does. Perhaps one final line of questions. I see that we're getting short on time, that have been coming in, have perhaps connect with the issues that we're seeing coming to the fore in the last few weeks around diversity.
Yes.
I know this is an area of research for you as well. So how does work design affect sort of positively and negatively the sort of diversity initiatives that we may all have in our organizations, but also help us move this agenda forward more assertively and effectively in the future?
Okay, I'll try to say two things quickly. I mean, first, we know that gender inequality is partly driven by an old-fashioned expectation that there's one way to build a career, and it involves 60 hours a week and travel and relocation as requested, etc. And historically, women have been less able and less willing to construct their lives around that ideal worker norm. So work redesign is an important way to say people can contribute and bring great value to the firm and still have the kinds of lives that they had envisioned. So that's one. The second thing I'll mention is that there's a possibility that more remote work and more hiring people in to teams remotely can help us diversify our teams. So, there are people who are tied to a certain because of caregiving or community obligations to a certain community. And there are people, I'll say Black and brown people, who maybe don't want to live in Champaign, Illinois, right? Or wherever, some rural or small town. And so to the extent that we can broaden the labor pool through remote work, we have a chance of also creating more ethnically and racially diverse teams.
I think this could turn out to be a very important impact of your work. In fact, I think that last point, broadening our talent pools and giving us access to regionally, nationally, and globally the talent that we need in our businesses and our organizations, for me seems like a very powerful argument that every executive and every shareholder should really resonate with as well. But this has been fascinating. I've learned a lot, as I always do when I'm talking with all of our faculty, but thank you again, Erin Kelly. I think we're just putting up again some information that people might be interested in our upcoming webinars, but let's not also forget, as Erin mentioned, her fantastic new book. I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy of this. Perhaps you need to do it virtually in the current circumstance. And if you'd like to learn more, please keep an eye out. We will be emailing some further follow-ups, as Lindsay mentioned, based on all the questions that have been coming in. With a short blog article where we'll try to get to some more answers, we hope. So thank you very much, Erin. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you all continue to remain safe and healthy, and we'll see many of you again soon. Thank you.